Hello and welcome to Thursday in Parliament, our look at the best of the day in the Commons and the Lords. On this programme, MPs and peers react to the dramatic court ruling that ministers need the approval of Parliament before the UK can start the process of leaving the EU.
It's all about Parliament's sovereignty.
Brexit means Brexit. This government is getting on with delivering it and making sure that it works for the whole of the United Kingdom.
The government unveils changes to the prison system in England and Wales.
Prisons punish by depriving people of their liberty. They must also reduce reoffending.
And the Foreign Secretary says the war against so-called Islamic State, or Daesh, is being won.
Daesh are now in retreat on every battlefront in Iraq and Syria.
But first, the High Court has ruled that it's up to Parliament to decide on whether the UK can start the process of leaving the European Union. It means campaigners have won their battle, preventing the government from triggering Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty on its own. Article 50 is the formal negotiating process for exiting the EU. The government says it'll appeal against the High Court decision. News of the court ruling broke at the start of the day, as the Commons was discussing international trade deals once Britain has left the EU.
In order to do a bilateral trade deal, we need to be out of the European Union. Does he therefore deplore, as I do, the High Court's decision this morning to rule against the government and say that the will of the people in the EU referendum on the 23rd is still subject to parliamentary approval?
Mr. Speaker, the government is disappointed by the court's judgment. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by Act of Parliament. The government is determined to respect the result of the referendum. This judgment raises important and complex matters of law, and it's right that we consider it carefully before deciding how to proceed.
Mr. Kevin Brennan. But will the government respect the ruling of the court in this matter, and also respect Parliament? And shouldn't it, if it wants to get on with these trade deals, shouldn't it accept that Parliament should have its say as the court has ruled?
Mr. Speaker, I have nothing to add other than to reiterate that it's right that the government will consider carefully before deciding how to proceed following the judgment.
I mean, the truth is that this Parliament always has been and always will be sovereign. So Parliament could overcome any trade deal it wanted. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether Parliament should resist the will of the people.
It's on the subject of debating and voting on essential trade matters. Isn't it essential now that the government give way to the courts and allow Parliament to be sovereign and to debate and vote on the issue of Article 50?
Will my right honourable friend confirm that, notwithstanding the court judgment this morning, Brexit means Brexit, and the will of the British people in the referendum will be respected?
Mr. Speaker, I entirely agree with him. I come as somebody who campaigned on the 23rd of June for the Remain side, but nevertheless I fundamentally totally agree that Brexit means Brexit. This government is getting on with delivering it and making sure that it works for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Could I refer to the answer given by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, in relation to today's ruling about Article 50 and the trigger that they say should be exercised within Parliament? I think my right honourable friend said the government will be appealing. Could I ask him, on behalf of the government, please to look at the learned judge's ruling and understand that it's not about a rerun of the arguments about the EU referendum. It's all about Parliament's sovereignty. And in that event, will the government look at it carefully to decide whether or not, in fact, the learned judges are right, and it's this place that should and indeed will trigger Article 50?
Not least, we will bear in mind the importance of referring to international trade in responding to the right honourable lady.
Mr. Speaker, as this is now an ongoing court case. I have nothing further to add to the comments I made earlier.
The front bench has tried to suggest that the High Court decision that Parliament should have a vote before triggering Article 50 is in some way anti-democratic or thwarts the referendum result. Will he acknowledge that the vast majority of members in this House are now committed to honouring the decision to leave the EU, but that democracy demands that the terms of our leaving must be subject to the proper advanced scrutiny and consent of this democratically elected House, and not negotiated in secret and smuggled through without the support of this sovereign Parliament?
Mr. Speaker, there will be numerous opportunities for the House to examine and discuss what the government is negotiating. When we are clear about the position we will adopt, then Article 50 will be triggered. But given the nature of the judgment this morning, we will now have to await the government's appeal to the Supreme Court.
More reaction came during questions on forthcoming parliamentary business.
The government has rightly decided to appeal to the Supreme Court. Does my right honourable friend appreciate that the vote to leave the European Union was fundamentally based on the sovereign act of Parliament, which expressly transferred the decision from Parliament to the voters of the United Kingdom as a whole?
And I think that, as I recall the debates on the referendum bill, honourable members on both sides of the House agreed, said in their speeches, that that was the consequence, of the political consequence of what we were doing in enacting that bill. The court has come to the judgment that it has today, and we will make a further statement, Mr. Speaker, on Monday when the attorney has had the chance to look in detail at the judgment.
Mr. Speaker, I realise the government is trying to maintain its efforts to stop the House having a vote on Article 50, but can my right honourable friend reassure me that he's not trying to assert that the government regards itself as not accountable to a vote in Parliament on its general policies of covering political, economic and trade relationships for the European Union for the duration of the several years that negotiations will no doubt take place?
And can I just say to the Leader of the House, his response thus far to the High Court ruling simply is not good enough. This is an important, significant ruling which suggests that this House is sovereign on these matters, and as a leader of this House, not just of this government, of this House, he should respect that. And what plans has he therefore got to bring an early vote on these matters to this House? And it's little wonder, is it, Mr. Speaker, that the Foreign Secretary refers to this process and compares it to the Titanic, because what we have is a stricken, doomed liner going to the bottom of the ocean, taking its captain with it. Well, I could tell you, Mr. Speaker, we in Scotland are preparing our lifeboat to get out of this, because there's no way that we're going to the deeps with this stricken government.
Pete Wishart with a nautical message following the remarks of the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson that Britain would make a Titanic success of exiting the EU. Well, reaction to the High Court judgment also came in the House of Lords.
But I wonder if I might ask him if he'd agree with two principles. First of all, no matter how high you are, the law is above you. And will he affirm unequivocally the sovereignty of Parliament?
Well, my Lords, we absolutely will abide by the sovereignty of Parliament, but I would also like to say that the reason that we are abiding by the process before us is to ensure that we are following the options open to us as regards appealing, and that is what we're doing.
It is interesting that Brexit was all about parliamentary sovereignty. We regret that the government will now appeal against the decision to give this decision back to Parliament. In fact, if they don't like the outcome of the Supreme Court, perhaps they're going to think of going to the European Court of Justice.
The referendum result was clear. 17.4 million people voted to leave, and the government has made it clear it wishes to deliver on that.
Lord Bridges. The Justice Secretary Liz Truss has unveiled what she calls a major overhaul of the prison system in England and Wales. Publishing a consultation paper, she said there would be 2,500 extra prison officers and £1.3 billion would be spent on building new prisons. But Labour MPs call the announcements too little, too late.
The prison system in England and Wales is under serious and sustained pressure. Rates of violence and self-harm have increased significantly over the past 5 years. And in the last 12 months to June 2016, there were nearly 6,000 assaults on staff and 105 self-inflicted deaths. Prisons punish by depriving people of their liberty. They must also reduce reoffending. My starting point is refocusing the system so that everyone is clear that safety and rehabilitation is the purpose of the prison system, setting this out for the first time ever in statute. In addition to HMP Berwyn in Wales, which will open from February 2017, we will build new prisons for men and women and close those prisons that do not have a long-term future in the estate.
This morning, the Secretary of State said that it was in July that she realised that there is a problem in our prisons. The rest of the country knew this reality well before then. There is a crisis in our prisons, although the Secretary of State refuses to openly admit it. The story in our prison system since 2010 is a story of spiralling violence and drug use. And the root cause of this prison crisis is the political decision to cut our prison service back to the bone. And today's announcement feels a lot like too little, too late. The Secretary of State wants the headline to be 2,500 extra prison staff, but 400 of these have already been announced, and it's 2,500 extra after over 6,000 fewer on the front line.
Overriding aim of protecting the public by reducing reoffending and avoiding future crime from those in prisons is almost impossible to achieve so long as they're overcrowded slums. And will she take the courageous decision to start addressing some of the sentencing policies of the 1990s and the 2000s, which accidentally doubled the prison population in overcrowded slums, and actually make sure that our prisons offer serious criminals who need punishment and find better ways of dealing with problems of mental health, drug abuse and irritating trivial offenders?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. I am not in favour of an arbitrary reduction of the number of prisoners we have in our prisons. What I am in favour of is reducing the reoffending rates so we stop people revolving through the system and going in and out of prisons.
We have 3,500 fewer prison officers in our prisons since 2010. At the same time, deaths and suicides in prisons is dramatically up. Assaults on prison officers is up as well. Can she not just come to that dispatch box and say, I admit it, too little, too late?
A former prisoner said to me that when he left he could mop a floor very well, but it wasn't going to pay the bills. And in the recent Dame Glenys Stacey in-depth look at 86 prisoners, not one left to go to a job. So could I urge in particular a real focus on construction skills from day one of a sentence, given we need 300,000 construction workers to build the houses this country needs and the infrastructure for our economy?
I have seen some excellent schemes in prison where, for example, Costa Coffee are offering jobs and training people up in being a barista, and also the example I gave earlier of Land Securities looking for scaffolding and dry lining workers, and again them training up in prison.
She said prisons should be looking at what jobs are available and train inmates accordingly. You're watching our roundup of the day. In the Commons and the Lords, still to come, calls for action to be taken against diesel cars to make our air healthier. The Foreign Secretary has told MPs that the so-called Islamic State terror group, sometimes called Daesh, is failing and disintegrating. Updating MPs on the current situation in Iraq and Syria, Boris Johnson said good progress was being made in the military operation to recapture territory gained in the two countries by Daesh.
The campaign to liberate Mosul opens a vital chapter in the struggle against Daesh. It will not be the final one. But Daesh are now in retreat on every battlefront in Iraq and Syria. After so much bloodshed, their downfall is not a matter of if, but when. I commend this statement to the House.
His opposite number focused on the operation to liberate the city of Mosul.
High numbers of civilian casualties are unfortunately probably inevitable. But can the Secretary of State tell us how the Iraqi forces plan to keep those casualties to a minimum when conducting their own operations? Also, Mr. Speaker, I am sure that the Secretary of State will have been as shocked as I was by the reports from Amnesty International of the Sunni tribesmen taking part in the anti-Daesh coalition, who have reportedly been engaged in reprisals in the villages that they have liberated around Mosul against civilians who are alleged to have supported Daesh. Can the Secretary of State tell the House how we can best ensure that such behaviour is not repeated inside Mosul itself?
Everybody understands the paramount importance of the point that the Right Honourable Lady makes about bridging the sectarian divide. And I think Prime Minister Abadi has really talked the right language about wanting to reconcile his city and his country and the communities therein.
The lives of 1.2 million civilians trapped in Mosul are indeed in grave danger, and their well-being is paramount, and no effort must be spared in ensuring that they are protected during the fighting and cared for in the aftermath. They've suffered long enough during the 2 years of Daesh occupation in their city.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Is the Foreign Secretary satisfied that he has the resources in the stabilisation unit, both in the United Kingdom and the stabilisation force within the United Nations, adequate to the task in Mosul? And can he give us his assessment of what is going on between Turkey and Iraq and the war of words between those leaders and the massing of Turkish armour on the borders of Iraq and indeed in Iraq?
There is a risk of disagreement about the nature of some of the Kurdish groups and the threat that they pose to Turkey and the utility that they have for the world in defeating Daesh.
Boris Johnson. MPs have called for the urgent introduction of a scrappage scheme for diesel vehicles in a bid to slash air pollution. Official data has suggested that poor air quality causes more than 40,000 premature deaths a year in Britain. Dozens of towns and cities suffer from illegal levels of nitrogen dioxide, largely emitted by diesel cars. For the second time in 18 months, a judge has ruled that plans to tackle air pollution are inadequate. But responding to an urgent question from a Conservative MP, the Minister refused to promise a scrappage scheme.
The EFRA Committee report in April on air quality called for all councils to have the power and the funding to implement clean air zones. Can the government give and make that commitment? The government has to look at getting the worst diesel vehicles off our roads quickly. Will the department consider financial incentives such as a scrappage scheme and change of the vehicle tax system?
We are working through it. We're coming up with what we can think to try and tackle this particular issue. But I do believe genuinely we have to have targeted interventions rather than using a sledgehammer to crack a nut everywhere. You know, if we go back in history, fiscal incentives were introduced by a Labour government which encourage people to move to diesel. I'm not going to complain about that. We are where we are now, and I think it really matters that government and local government all pull together, because we do care about the people we represent.
We cannot afford for this to continue or blame to be shifted to councils. It is negligence. I therefore ask, can the government guarantee that instead of creating just 5 clean air zones, it will now put in place a network of zones across all 37 out of the 43 areas with high emission levels? Why has the government wasted time and resources fighting court cases instead of fighting air pollution?
We already have reduced nitrogen dioxide by 41% in the last 10 years. We are still taking action to do that. You know, let's not get into the blame game, or we can go back to the history of Labour and what they did about diesel in the first place. That's not worthwhile, Mr. Speaker. What matters is that we pull together and address this issue.
With the autumn statement imminent, will she now go back and work with the Department for Transport and, critically, the Treasury to unblock the pipeline and make sure that we stop dirty diesel?
My own constituents have had enough of an appalling state of air quality. I know I'm in the middle of a big city here, but it applies, I know, to many other parts of the country. We need to ensure that the perverse incentives for diesel are stopped in their tracks. I hope that she will make those representations to the highest level.
I gently suggest to the Minister that
talking about sledgehammers and nuts in this context is not really appropriate. This is the second biggest avoidable killer after smoking. She needs a sledgehammer, and she needs to take a sledgehammer to the Treasury. But given that this is the second humiliating defeat the government has suffered in the courts, surely there was a plan to announce some action here today in response to the defeat. Where is it? Where are the new measures?
The right honourable gentleman will be aware from his time in government that measures do take some time to work up. I am...
in 13 years of getting this.
The right honourable gentleman might shake his head. You know, I'm not going to get into the blame game with what happened under Labour in getting more diesel vehicles on the road.
Exactly.
But I will say, Mr. Speaker, I'm working closely with officials in order to come up with a wide set of actions that we wish to deploy, and I can only say that we hope to announce those in due course.
We need a scrappage scheme to get these filthy, belching diesel buses and cars off our towns and cities. We are choking and poisoning children. That's why we need action now.
We've done the analysis, and trying to just have one particular kind of scheme where any diesel car can be replaced would not be the best use of either taxpayers' money, because it's not a targeted intervention. I really want to be smart about this and use taxpayers' money effectively so that we can tackle this issue, not just have a comprehensive scrappage scheme which won't help the issue.
The ban on direct flights from the UK to the Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh is having a catastrophic impact on the economy of Egypt. That was the claim made in the House of Lords when peers focused on the effect of the ban, which followed the incident a year ago when a Russian passenger plane exploded over the Sinai Peninsula, killing all 224 people on board. It had taken off from Sharm el-Sheikh.
UK aviation security experts continue to work closely with their Egyptian counterparts on the ground, sharing their expertise in establishing effective security arrangements. We look forward to achieving the return of flights once we can be assured that of there being the necessary secure and sustainable security situation on the ground.
We now have a situation where Belgian and German flights are being resumed. And indeed, as my noble friend said, all other Egyptian airports are open for business. In these circumstances, given that Sharm el-Sheikh is the epicenter of Egyptian tourism, will my noble friend look afresh and very directly at these new changed circumstances, given the fact that this is having a catastrophic impact on the Egyptian economy and its stability, and also on our winter tour operators?
He mentioned the issue of other flights or other nations choosing to return flights. That's very much a matter for them, but I'm minded by the fact that we're as yet to see the final results of the inquiry the Egyptians themselves have conducted in terms of the Metrojet crash. And of course he'll also be aware that the Russians, who were obviously involved directly with that inquiry, are also yet to report back, although they provisionally did say that the result of that crash was a terrorist attack on the plane.
My lords, in Marks and Spencer's when I was there, we didn't employ technologists who delighted in banning things because of risk. We employed people who found the creativity in finding solutions. Are those who are responsible for banning these flights aware of the risk to British citizens of radicalising the 4 million people we're putting out of work in Egypt?
Does the government recognise that Egypt is one of the few beacons of hope in the Middle East, and that to allow its economy to be damaged as it is being damaged risks undermining President Sisi's attempt to establish a tolerant, secular state where all religions are acceptable?
Fully endorse everything that's been said about the importance of British citizens, of course, but the impact that this is having on some of the poorest and most destitute people who would normally be engaged in the tourism industry cannot be overestimated. It really is an opening to those those who do not wish Egypt well within Egypt, those who are fostering terrorism. And I ask the noble Lord if he will look afresh at this, as Lord Risby asked in the original supplementary question, look afresh at this and do everything he can.
Finally, news of a parliamentary success in cycling, or at least in static cycling. A Westminster event to see which MP could cycle the furthest, in electronic terms, on a bike machine, was won by the Lib Dem Tom Brake, who, despite his name, is a speedy performer. His success was announced to the Chamber by the Commons Speaker John Bercow.
Yes, before I call the honourable gentleman the member for Carshalton and Wallington, I move to congratulate him on his achievement in winning the yellow jersey for his performance yesterday on the British Legion stationary bicycle. It was a remarkable athletic feat on the part of the honourable gentleman, Mr. Tom Brake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's nice to come first at something when you're a Liberal Democrat.
Tom Brake able to laugh at himself, or at least at his party. That's it for this programme. Do join me for the Week in Parliament, when we not only look back at the last few days in the Commons and the Lords, but also discuss how next week's US presidential election might impact on politics here in the UK. For now, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.